Good morning, everyone. This is Katie Hyatt. I'm with the Women's Financial Inclusion Community of Practice, and I lead the Technology Working Group. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. For the next hour, we'll be talking about the role of trust in increasing women's access to finance through DFS. A few housekeeping rules before we start. So we've got everyone on mute, but please do not let that stop you from asking questions. We'd ask that you submit questions to all panelists so that people can see what other people are interested in and build off that. At the end of the presentation, we'll send out a brief survey, and we'd be most appreciative if you could fill it out. Only 3 questions. And finally, just a quick point, the paper on the role of trust has not yet been published, but will be coming out in the next 10 days. As soon as it comes out, we'll be posting it on D groups, and that will be going straight to your inbox. So we'd encourage you to sign up for the Women's Financial Inclusion D group. I'll give you the address at the end of the presentation. One moment. So, today in the room with me, I have Fernando Maldonado, who is the Digital Finance Team Lead at the USAID Center for Digital Solutions, Digital Development. I have Shelley Spencer, who is the CEO of SIA, Strategic Impact Advisors, and Mandana Nakai, who's the Program Manager with Strategic Impact Advisors. The Women's Financial Inclusion COP was founded at the end of 2016. It's a CGAP-facilitated platform which brings together practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and donors, anyone who has expertise and interest in women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion. It was brought together due to the increasing interest in women's financial inclusion. There's been a lot of initiative and activity in this space in recent years, and without coordination, which there wasn't, we run the risk of repeating ourselves and being ineffective in the space. There's also significant knowledge gaps in the area, and there's need for a more informed dialogue and intentional exchange around the challenges and solutions to women's greater financial inclusion. With all the different parties moving forward with different activities, it's hard to create any large-scale impact. We've just seen that the gender gap in account ownership has stayed stagnant for the last 3 years. If we want to see large-scale change here, we need to collaborate and coordinate better. Create a shared learning agenda. So the Women's Financial Inclusion COP has 3 working groups: data, social norms, and technology. The data group is chaired by Dina Bourgigi. The social norms working group is chaired by Nisha Singh. The intention of this is to keep you up to date with existing practices, projects that are happening, new resources that can be utilized, to stimulate learning, to make sure that people are speaking to each other and pushing the needle further as opposed to repeating what has already been created, and to convene through calls, webinars like this that we hold, and regional meetings. The Technology Working Group is specifically focused on digital financial services and how we can improve our approach to this subject area. The last 10 years has seen an enormous growth in the use of digital technologies and development, and DFS remains one of the biggest opportunities and the most challenging areas to work. And we know that women are disproportionately affected by low account ownership or usage and lower access to digital finance. This is an opportunity for us to document what is working and be honest about what isn't working and how we can collaborate better together. and also understand what is emerging. I mean, we hear a lot of words around, blockchain and sensors and, other bright, shiny objects, and, how do we sense check this and ensure that what we're doing makes sense and is actually serving the end client. Feel free to reach out to me. My email address is below. Love to hear from you. We would love anyone to join the working group. We currently have around 600 people in the community of practice across 300 organizations. This is just a brief snapshot of some of the organizations that are part of the community of practice. It's open to anyone. So anyone who's interested in closing the gender gap in women's financial services, sharing relevant tools and resources, developing best practices, innovative solutions to these pressing problems, and just improving your skills or disseminating knowledge, experiences that you've had. It's a networking opportunity for the 600 plus and growing group of people focused on this issue. So we have a website, www.microfinancegateway.org/WFI COP. There's a LinkedIn group which you can join, follow us on Twitter, or just drop me an email. I would say that the best way to keep up to date, you can sign up here for our mailing list that you can see at the bottom right of this page. But I would also encourage you to join our D groups. If you join the D groups, you'll receive the trust paper hot off the press, but you'll also find out about opportunities, new resources, and other areas focused on women's use of financial services. So the D groups is dgroups.org/UNCDF/WFI_COP. And we'll include that at the end with a poll. I'm now going to hand it over to Fernando Maldonado, who's going to talk a little bit about USAID's focus on digital financial services and their commitment over the years to closing the gender gap in women's use of digital financial services. So without further ado, Fernando.
Great. Good morning, all. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, CGAP, for hosting today's webinar on this key topic of trust and the role it plays in women's access to financial services through digital technologies. I had to apologize a bit. I'm still recovering from the pollen explosion that we all experience here in Washington, D.C., so apologies if I'm a little groggy. So yeah, it goes without question. At USAID, we've seen how providing women with opportunities to better their health, education, and well-being has effects far beyond a single individual. A woman multiplies the impact and investment made in her future by extending benefits to the world around her, creating a better life for her family, and building a strong community. I've seen this personally firsthand in places like northern Nigeria and Central America, where local governments and community-based organizations supported by USAID were most successful when they facilitated relationships that built off existing social capital, where women in these communities were already playing a big role. Of course, my time in Nigeria was nearly 10 years ago, and the world is a much different place today than it was then. The advancement of technology, mobiles in particular, is making a tremendous difference in the world. Financial services alone have gone through a transformation where all of a sudden banking services that were otherwise unavailable to low-income consumers can now be accessed through a basic mobile phone. With that low-tech, high-touch access, you open the doors to other relevant services, such as clean water, energy, and health services. And these become so important to poor customers, women in particular. So despite these advancements, just as digital technology has become an increasingly important tool to improving the various facets of life in the developing world, women are being left behind. You can go no further than the evidence where we see 1.7 billion women in low and middle income countries still do not own mobile phones. And the gap between men and women using the internet has grown steadily over the past 3 years. it's clear that access takes many forms, from not only the hardware of the physical phone, but the ability to actually use it. What good is a phone if a woman can't read or write or can only use it with permission from her husband? So recognizing this need and opportunity, USAID is investing $1.5 million into the Women Connect Challenge. Hopefully those on the webinar are familiar with this challenge. The challenge is meant to identify and accelerate comprehensive solutions that empower women and girls to access and use digital technology to drive positive health, education, and livelihoods outcomes for themselves and their families. The deadline is actually coming up this week. Friday is the deadline, May 4th. So my hope is that those on the phone, if you have some great ideas, I encourage you to please submit. Perhaps this presentation will inspire you to submit something, so please do. In addition to Women's Connect, we have several tools and resources, one of which is the Gender ICT Toolkit, which was launched a year ago. I know Katie played a big role in putting that together. It's a tremendous resource that helps assess the gender and ICT landscape. It was meant and created primarily for implementing partners, but I would say that it's quite agnostic in terms of those who can use it. But it serves as a great tool to really understanding how the marketplace works in terms of ICT and the interface with women and girls. In addition to that, we have a number of resources, including an online course. You can access these at www.digitaldevelopment.org. We'll also have the trust paper there as well once it is released. So just a bit about the USAID digital finance practice. Our long-term vision is to build an inclusive and sustainable DFS ecosystem in the countries we partner with as a means to accelerating their pathway to self-reliance. So this is for the grandiose vision that we have in the countries that we partner with. We work toward this vision by focusing really on two main objectives. The first is the integration of digital financial services into USAID projects and programs across a number of sectors, including agriculture and food security, health, energy, and education. In agriculture, for example, there's consistent and compelling evidence that when the status of women is improved, agricultural productivity increases, poverty is reduced, and nutrition improves. So we really see digital financial services not as its own sector per se, but really as a sector-agnostic enabler of these development objectives. The second objective is really the broadening of these sector and program-specific efforts to foster an inclusive enabling environment and really encourage private sector investment and demand for inclusive financial services. This is done both through our relationship with USAID operating units and missions, but also external engagement with our various, the various global alliances, including CGAP. So a big part of our work requires us to examine the entire ecosystem, in particular the demand and supply side of the marketplace, and how low-income populations interact and perceive service offerings. That is why this paper is so relevant and important, as it's not just a matter of handing out phones, but really examining the social dynamics and complexities of uptake and appropriate usage. So I, for one, am very excited. I know this has been a work in progress for quite some time, and so I really commend NetHope SIA for taking the lead and putting this together. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Shelley Spencer, and I look forward to discussion at the end.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Fernando, and thanks, Katie. It's Shelley Spencer, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this and to give you a preview of the paper that will be released in the coming weeks. But I will say it's been kind of a work in progress for probably 6 years. We've been working with USAID on DFS, and personal value of mine has always been, what does that mean for women? So I think we're at a really important time right now where we've had a lot of experience with technology. We're getting a lot of learnings, and trust is coming up as an issue not only for technology but also the broader ecosystem of women's financial inclusion. So we're super excited to release the paper, and when you see it, I hope you know that it's meant to be a thought piece to provoke conversation, and we're hoping it will do that. And then our real goal is to create some intentionality around working on trust and going deeper and thinking about what does that mean. Because we are finding that research is pointing to a trust deficit in DFS with women, and we're seeing some nuances between men and women from the data that is being collected both by GSMA and in survey-based instruments like the CGAP smallholder farmer surveys, which I would encourage everybody to look at that. Also, the Small Farmer Data Hub was released, and you can do gender disaggregated analysis there as well as the recent index. So I think we have a lot of data. It's always not saying what we want in terms of narrowing of the gap, but it's interesting. We've also seen DFS providers who are interested in uptake from a business perspective, focusing on the issue of trust if it's something from the supply side that they need to work on. And I think with technology in particular, when we're moving away from a human interface to a technology interface, trust becomes very important. So again, thank you to the CGAP Community of Practice. I'm excited that Katie is joined to lead the Technology Working Group on such a strong talent. And also for us to be a part of the CGAP Community of Practice. We started with USAID having a conversation, and I think part of that maybe created the Community of Practice. I'm not sure we can take credit for that, but it was one of our early discussions about what people are doing together. And also thank you to NetHope, who has been an organization that we've worked with through and for USAID to do this work as well. So the purpose of the paper is really to look at, to generate ideas, as I talked about, and look at some approaches. But when you get it, and we do hope you read it, it's not incredibly lengthy. So it has 3 sections. One, it looks at evidence. So we did a landscape survey. It's not original research, so it's looking at what is already out there. So we look at the evidence of a trust gap, and there's been great work done by Women's World Banking and GBA and others who are members of the Community of Practice, as well as GSMA and CGAP, that we look to in terms of what's current thinking on trust and technology. Then we look at a couple models that could be used to actually create an analytical framework for thinking about trust to create, for the researchers in the Community of Practice, maybe a construct to be used, and for the practitioners, some really interesting ways that we could track the influence of trust, and we're going to present some suggestions on how that could happen, and then also really encourage you to share work that you've been doing in your own practices to work on this, whether it's research or actually running a program with women or working with a provider. And then how it's kind of integral to everything. And then we'll suggest some approaches. So with that, we're just going to review a little bit of the evidence of financial services writ large. And I think certainly in the Community of Practice, and I'm hoping in the broader community, I think this is now a given that financial services do increase women's economic empowerment. So we've seen that the roadmap for women economic empowerment last year, 2 years ago, that was put out, moved savings to a proven intervention that actually increases women's empowerment. We know that for women, particularly women who are economically at the bottom level of the rung, insurance, microfinance, and payments can provide a way to get entry into the formal financial services sector. And a lot of women still continue to be outside that formal sector. And I think increasingly as we think about the Women's Connect Challenge, and one of the goals of USAID is what happens if women aren't in the digital economy. And as things continue to migrate, whether it's government systems or transfers to a digital device, do we risk leaving women out of that? And what does that mean? So I think it's a broader mandate as the world continues to shift to platforms and technology delivery. So what do we see from the data that we've seen recently? And I will say that let's just look at some of the barriers that we talked about. A lot of these are well known. So when we look at barriers, particularly for DFS, I'm not going to read through this because I think a lot of you on the phone would hopefully agree with this. But DFS with the technology, if we can get it trusted, used, and actively used, can address a lot of these barriers that have been historical for women's exclusion from formal financial services. And then we would really add the last, which is trust in financial service providers, and is there a way with the technology and certain interventions to develop that trust that has been evasive in some ways. So we do know, I would also put out this caution, and we heard this from our peer review group, which we use the Community of Practice to do. We know that this is country-specific, and I believe it's also women-specific. So we know, sitting here in a room of very talented women, that we're not all homogeneous, and Fernando, we're not homogeneous. So I think thinking about that, how do we look at those nuances, and how do we think about designing programs and interventions so we're not being so blanket and global that we miss those nuances. So I appreciate the peer review drawing our attention to that as well. So some of the data, I think it was kind of New York Times bestseller week when we get Findex data, so I'm super excited about that. I'm waiting for April 19th, so thank you, World Bank, for continuing to do that. But the numbers on the gender gap are discouraging. So they didn't move, as everybody here who's probably read the report know. They didn't move really in this 2-year cycle or since the beginning of the Findex. So I think that's something that we really need to think about. Why is that? That hasn't happened. And one of the other conclusions was that digital technology, mobile money in sub-Saharan Africa was moving things, but maybe not everywhere else. So how do we think about that? And also, as Fernando pointed out, the gap isn't just in financial services, but it continues to exist in a very significant way in mobile phone ownership. So with that, we'd like to talk about the model that we have and why we think trust in particular is an issue that we need to pay attention to. So trust with technology, interesting in reading some of the literature, it really talks about it's necessary to have some risk element for trust to be required, because you need to have a little bit of fear in order to say that I need to get to a point of trusting it. And I think we find that with things that are new or novel, or maybe something that's not in your universe of daily use, including financial services. And then if you have, we've seen evidence collected mainly in surveys that are country specific, but that women do tend to adopt financial services slower, whether it's a banking product that Women's World Banking has studied, or whether it's a digital financial service product that GSMA has looked at. So a lot of good work has been done really in the past 3 or 4 years. And some of that research also shows that for women in particular, if they're feeling the risk more pronounced than men might feel, that they need more interactions with the particular device and the process to feel comfortable. So with that, we'd like to talk about how we looked at models of increasing trust that could really lead to a behavior change, and what our goal would be actual system and active system use by women of these financial services. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Mandana, and she'll take you through the model.
Great, thank you, Shelley. So for this work, we wanted to explore what analytical models or methods have been used in the past to really better understand how people make the decision to adopt technologies, and to see if any of these models might be adaptable for practitioners in this space. So we looked at 2 different frameworks, which you can see on the slide, but there certainly are many more ways to model the technology adoption process. In the basic microeconomic model, what determines whether someone will adopt a new technology is their calculation of the net gain or benefit they are going to experience from adoption after accounting for the cost of use. So the critique of this model is that it doesn't account for some of the inherent complexity of the decision that makes it difficult for people to really assess accurately the cost to adoption, which can be much more than just the price tag. For example, there may be social costs that are hard to calculate the size of clearly. And the decision to trust or mistrust is not always rational in the economic sense, which makes it hard to incorporate into this model. So the Technology Acceptance Model, or TAM, which you can see here up on the slide, is a different approach that theorizes which factors influence the decision to adopt a new technology and allows users to test their validity individually. So the TAM basically posits that decision to use a technology can be broken down into a few discrete factors. The adopter's attitude toward using, which is informed then by their perception of the ease of use and perceived usefulness of the technology. And then these are, in turn, are driven by many external factors, which we believe and are focusing on includes trust. So measuring these factors and the extent to which they really do predict adoption basically involves developing psychometric scales, a series of statements that get at how the respondent perceives how easy and useful they find the technology, which the respondent rates their agreement with along a Likert scale. Separately, the respondents are asked about their intention to use and their actual use of the technology. So basically the respondents or responses from the Likert scale are analyzed to see if they correlate with the respondents' intention to use and actual use. And you can also do a longitudinal study to see if the respondents are actually using the technology in the future. So that is the basic methodology. So the TAM, like any theoretical model, definitely has its critiques and its drawbacks, but in many cases has been found to be a strong predictor of adoption. A lot of the studies out there take the basic model and add on additional factors, external factors or variables that they want to test in their field. To date, there don't seem to be many applications of the TAM in international development work, but here on the slide are a few examples of the types of technologies that have been studied with the TAM, and there are many more. So the original TAM doesn't include trust in the model, but later versions do, as a factor influencing perceived ease of use, usefulness, and attitude toward using directly. So for this paper, we decided to build upon that latter version to break down what factors we think would first influence trust as one of the external variables. Shelley is going to dive a bit more deeply into the 5 attributes of trust you can see on the left-hand side here that we propose to include in the model. But the main takeaway here is that what we're proposing with the model is that it's a way to break down the otherwise murky topic of technology adoption and trust into factors that can be isolated and therefore explored independently. So by isolating these factors that influence trust, we think you can start to figure out which ones matter the most in the context you're working in and test those independently. And from there, the idea is to use that information to design interventions. So we hope this model can be used as a starting point for breaking trust down from something that's complex and definitely context and culturally specific into pieces that are discrete enough that you can actually get more information about them from potential technology adopters through survey work. And in the process, adapting the model to include the variables that make sense in the context of the work you're doing.
Great. Thanks, Mandana. So one thing, too, on the model is as you think through and walk through it with us, think about would the model be applied differently at different stages of a woman's journey to financial inclusion and digital financial services. So if someone's already an account holder and we're trying to get her to active use or use of a bundled set of services, would this model look different than if we're just trying to get someone to be a first-time user and an account holder? So we think that this model might have different applications in your work depending on where you are in the chain. And again, we encourage members of the community of practice and people who are interested in the field to really give us their thoughts about what we've identified as the 5 levers of influence and then how you're seeing these might be pulled or possible. So the first one is not going to be a surprise, and there's a lot of work on this with global institutions looking at RegTech and other things, but it's basically if something goes wrong, what do I do? And do I have recourse? So we all hear, and certainly we heard in the early days, how can I trust that the money on my phone is going to get where it needs to go, and what happens if it goes to the wrong number? So that's still a real concern, and it's a real concern for people that are not first-time users. So we need to have, from a regulatory perspective, we need to have frameworks that our providers are required to follow. But beyond the frameworks, we need to have a way for women and all consumers to understand how to activate those frameworks. So it's great to say you need to have an active customer service line. It's frustrating if that customer service line doesn't work, or as we've all sat on hold, it takes you 20 minutes to get to someone and then they don't know what you're talking about. So I think we can all relate to this, that it's important that you have product recourse, and there's a lot of conversation about what does that mean? And for DFS in particular, because sometimes it's delivered through an agent-based model, we have a local presence where there's a place and maybe someone who is known within the community who can provide that physical place for somebody to get their recourse. But those agents need to be trained. So again, what is the data showing? Some of it is showing that women may not adopt the technology because they're worried about making a mistake, and that female consumers in particular, more than men, tend to be concerned about what do I do if something goes wrong. So suggested intervention would be really to work on that, both on the consumer and the provider side. How do we make sure that those recourse mechanisms are available, understood, and are efficient? Attribute number 2 what we looked at is actually the company. And we would, for DFS, we would break down the company not just to be the provider, but also to be the agent, who is the last mile service provider of that company. So Michael Joseph said, now celebrating the 10th year of M-Pesa, we cannot afford to have a dropped call if we're providing mobile money. And I think we all get that, but there have been some instances, luckily few and far between, that we've been able to identify where there have been issues of trust with either the agent perpetuating fraud or the company not being reliable. And this doesn't just go to technology. I would say that the CGAP smallholder farmer surveys did look at trust of financial institutions. In some places, like in Bangladesh, there might be different perceptions of trust of financial institutions and lower of mobile money. And in other countries, you might find mobile money is more trusted than banks. So it's all going to determine it's going to depend on the context and what the experience has been. So things that have been tried and are being tried by a number of organizations are using female agents in particular, but I would put the caution out there that Grameen has put out that we can't create women-only solutions, so we need to think about the women agents within the broader ecosystem and not get into a siloed approach that could lead to lower levels of investment and things that aren't sustainable. Number 3, when we talk about it, is actually the advocates who would help develop, and this I think applies most specifically when you're a first-time user. So we've seen a lot of great work with savings groups, and the NGOs have tended to be the leaders of getting the savings groups into links to formal financial institutions. I know the CEIF conference is coming up and has a focus on that. And one of the things has been the NGO role there as the educator, as the advocate, to spur that initial adoption and the migration from maybe a paper-based, solely local village savings and loan to one that is linked with a digital phone to a formal financial service, whether that's a group account remains a group account or whether that's something that ends up having the individuals having their own accounts. So thinking about that, I would say it's important, again, the context to figure out who does the community trust. So in some cases, it could be booster agents, it could be advocates who are working within the community on other types of programs. Maybe they're running a health program. USAID's doing a lot of integration of DFS into its portfolio. So if there's ag extension workers and they happen to be trusted, could they also be these trusted agents? Number 4 is really a self-empowerment tool. And so it's how do we build technical understanding for self-generated trust. So how do we get people to use the technology, trust that they know how to use it, and that they are comfortable doing that? So this, again, is where you see GSMA done some interesting research on women who are regular users and power users, and how do we get them to the power users, and how many transactions does it take? And does it take more time to actually do the training? And are we incentivizing agents and others who might be providing that training to spend the time that might be necessary? So our end goal, and when we did this paper, I will say we had a very user-centric focus where we were thinking about an individual user of a product and how do we help her generate trust. And our peer review group, who was very wise and experienced, said to us, you also have to think about the broader social context and social norms. So this is a very user-centric attribute that we were interested in testing, but it does have to be considered in context where there might be norms that could make this something that would either do harm or not be appropriate. So thinking about people have been talking about, do we have training groups and make sure they're gender inclusive, all of those kinds of things. So that one I personally think is really important, but it takes time. I know I have probably 60% of apps on my phone I use once, and then if it's too hard, too many clicks, I'm not going to keep doing it. And then the last attribute we have is really peer acceptance. So this goes to who do you know in your community. So whether it's the circle of women at the water well, whether it's somebody at the conference in Bangkok, I think it was Steve, right? The Women's Economic Empowerment was saying from CARE said to me, you know, where's the water cooler for these women? Where are people getting their information? And research with networks that people have done for women's social networks might mean they're more horizontal than vertical, which may be different than men. So how do we find those advocates that can say, hey, I'm using it, why don't you try it? Or I just got money from my child who's in the city, look at how this happened. So is there a way to have peer advocates who can be those leaders who bring users along the curve, and how do we find them and how do we empower them? So that's what we looked at as the 5 that are described.
I seem to have lost sound. Just a moment, everyone listening in, I just received a message that we lost sound, but that it is up again. So sorry for that interruption, Charlie, and please continue.
Okay, so good news is we're on the last slide, so it's going to be our turn to hear your questions. So what do we think to do next? And again, I will say we have a bias for let's dig in and do something. So this is our attempt at what do we do? And like the community of practice, we don't want to duplicate what others are doing. So we'd like to, one, learn from each other. So one thing we were talking around is would we have people on the phone or that you know who'd be interested in participating in some of the 5 trust attributes we've just talked about in a conversation at more detail. But then also could we just look at what would actually influence at the beginning of the journey account registration, because we know from GSMA that there's data that shows the gender gap is larger at account registration, and once women become users, that gap narrows. Maybe that's what Findex is telling us. I'm not quite sure, but certainly that gap at Findex is account ownership basic. So could we work on that, and how do we develop that trust just at the account level? And can we incentivize at the provider level, at the regulatory level, everybody in the ecosystem, and the donor level, getting women registered? Now, caution that we've talked about also as well is, you know, we're seeing some great numbers out of India on accounts, but are they actively used? And so what have we accomplished? So I think that would mean, are there other places of the journey that we can't just be focused on registration? We also have to look at how do we build trust, and maybe that's with advocates to get increased use and activity of a bundled suite of products. And I would love activity. I know there's some work to define it as not just every 90 days, one activity, because that seems very small. And the last thing would be really to just develop some insights and technical assistance, and this is more on kind of the donor side. There was that great report Amidiar funded, the Buck Short, that talked about kind of the cycle that women have, the life cycles, and how products might not be fitting those life cycles. So could we do something if we increase the relevance, and back to the TAM, having that being the usefulness, if it really is behavior change and is it perceived useful for me, and is the ease of use there? I think that's why we found this technology adoption model particularly relevant for DFS and the journey of women to become active users. So with that, we welcome your comments. I'll turn back to Katie.
Great. And just to respond quickly to Sylvia's question, we will be making the presentation available. We'll be sending it out after we're done here, providing you fill out our survey, of course. There's no proviso, you'll get the presentation. So we do have some questions that have come in from the audience. I mean, I think one, having not, you know, I think people on the call haven't read the report in great detail yet, and obviously that will be coming out soon. But just putting it back to Mandana and Shelley, you know, based on this research and based on all the analysis that you've done over the last months and years, you know, what would the sort of 3 takeaways for practitioners be? So put you on the spot.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, trust is complicated, and we know that. So I think what we were trying to do is provide an analytical framework. I think one of the questions would be, of those 5 attributes, one in isolation is not going to move the needle entirely. So what are those combination of attributes, and where do they work, and in what context? So I think thinking about social norms and thinking about the broader context, are there environments where pulling one of those trust attribute levels will be more effective than the other? I think we'd want to know that. I think we're learning that trust, there are gender variations in the role. The landscape review kind of showed that it is an issue, and I think people have touched on that. So we shouldn't be shy that there's some gender deviation there, and how do we tackle that as we try to close the gap and for active use. And then I would say that, to Manana's point, why we picked this model, it's not cost-benefit. We spent a lot, I think, of the early years talking about the cost-benefit of mobile money and digital financial services, and I think the data is showing us it's not just that. So we can show a business case maybe to the provider. We can show it might be in the long term more cost-effective to use this than use a different, more manual form of cash processing in your financial life. But in the end of the day, that's not going to make people active users. So I think it's this societal look at behavior change is important.
Sure. I would just add that, you know, while trust is complex and emotional, I think we hope people take away from this that there are ways that are qualitative and rigorous to actually dig into how people are experiencing trust or mistrust in their experiences with DFS.
Great, thanks. So a question for Fernando. This is from Sophia. Fernando referenced the research around improving women's agricultural production, leading to a range of gender equality results. Can you expand on this at all? And is the research available?
Sure. I can, and I may not have a great answer, but I can certainly point you to the right resources and research. I don't have the specific research for me, but the reference there was with regard to productivity and improved nutrition. There's been a number of studies. As a matter of fact, CGAP had released something a couple of years ago on the effect of SDGs, the impact of financial inclusion in financial services on SDGs, and it found that access to savings account, I believe the study was out in Nepal, increased consumption. You could also look toward the recent study by Billy Jack that points to resilience, and I think what's interesting about that is what that study also found beyond just improvements at the household level is that it actually generated a pathway to more sophisticated economic activity. So women were sort of moving from subsistence farming to then opening their own SMEs and engaging in more sophisticated economic activity. And I think that holds true whether it's urban, peri-urban, or in a rural context. I think one thing to be really mindful of, it's interesting, you know, we're guilty of that USAID and stovepiping sectors, but if you think about it, more than 70% of the population we work with are working in an ag context. So a lot of the numbers that we talk about, in essence, are within the context of rural environments and agriculture.
Great. A question from Marina. Would you prioritize trust attributes? Which ones would you focus on? Amanda and Charlie.
Yeah, so I would say if we look at the 5, I would say because it's last mile delivery a lot with DFS, I would prioritize peer acceptance and a trusted advocate, because I think the other 3, which are technical understanding, trusted company, and product recourse, those will follow if you have the peer acceptance and the trusted advocate. So I would say it's that last mile delivery, and given that women tend to want to have more, and I know this is a generalization, but if more training, more transactions, more assisted transactions are important, I would prioritize those last mile touch trust attributes.
Great. A question from Saloni. Does the research include how easy or difficult it is to convince DFS providers to address the trust barrier for women? What recommendations do you have to convince DFS providers of this need?
Yeah, it does not touch on that, but it's a great question. And one of the reasons we looked at this again from a user-centric perspective, so solely looking at the user. I would point you to another resource, the Catalyst Group, which had some funding from USAID and has worked a lot in India, developed a trust toolkit as well. Maybe we can share that link, but it's focused on the supply side, and we referenced that in the study. So it talks about how providers could try to develop trust in their products. I mean, I think in the end of the day, if you think of Michael Joseph, the father of M-Pesa, I guess we could call him, if he said to his team, we can't have a dropped call, given that it's a business and your business is subscriber-based a lot for mobile financial services in particular, you are going to lose that subscriber if you don't do the trust. So I think there's a financial incentive on the provider side for that to happen. But we did not delve into that, but I would refer to that catalyst toolkit.
Definitely, and CGAP, actually, the community of practice has recently been developing some cheat sheets on key themes that continually come up when we look at financial services and digital financial services. So maybe that's something that we can, in the future, pull together different resources around trust and how we, dig into these deep-rooted social norms. So a question from Saloni, and it's a tricky one. How do we go from behavioral intention to use to actual use? Intent to the actual.
Yeah, so I think, intention to use means maybe exploration of that. So intention to use could be, again, through this peer acceptance and trusted advocate, or we've seen with the savings groups, there might be an NGO or a donor initiated try this. We're seeing that also with like cash transfers, where that's the way they're coming. So you kind of have to get there on intention to use. So is there an incentive needed, or can we have organic self-intention to use? So I guess that's kind of two categories of buckets I would think about. A lot of the early thinking in the space was that if we work on payments, like the Better Than Cash Alliance and the Gates Foundation Pathway to Financial Inclusion, start with payments, because that creates almost a mandate to use as opposed to behavioral intention to use. And then from that, I think the GSMA research is super interesting. Once women get on, once they're registered, the gender gap narrows, but then how do we make them active users? So I think actual system use has to be, I'm on it, but the system use, the actual use has to be, it's relevant. So is it relevant to me? Is it improving my lives? And we're seeing in the agriculture sector that Fernando was mentioning, for farmers, maybe getting their crop payments digitally aren't enough, but could you get insurance with that? School fees is an area of interest. So does that make actual system use?
Yeah, and I would just add that, my view is the sort of reason that it's good to break these two down in the model is just to be honest about the fact, which I think we're all aware of, that the intention to use can be quite different from actual system use. And so kind of factoring that into the model allows you to see, is there a really big gap in the group that we're working with between those who have self-reported their, intention to use and then their actual system use. And adding that kind of longitudinal aspect to a study, I think, can also add a lot of nuance to answering that question.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is I know from a lot of the survey work that's been done, the CGAP smallholder farmers, again, surveys, again, are a great resource. They show that awareness of mobile money is high, but actual use is not. So the question is kind of where is that? So maybe we haven't, why don't we have the intention to use if awareness is high? So, Fernando?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is that, I think there's a tendency to look at research within our own field or lens or sector, but frankly, a lot of this work has been done. If we take a look at what folks have done in the health world and with utilization of, nutritious foods and wash campaigns and things like that, I think there's actually a lot that one can extract in terms of behavioral change, and I think the added dynamic here is, of course, sharing that with sort of more of the supply side. Shelley mentioned the importance of payments. I think we often think of payments from the perspective of private sector, which certainly has a huge role, but I think there's a big role for governments to play as well, and sort of being that big payer in a lot of the markets that we work in. So you sort of have to work both sides, and I think it's a matter of cross-pollination of learning and sharing between supply and demand.
Yeah, and that leads well into Josephine's question around whether financial services via free platforms like WhatsApp can push down the cost of payments. Perhaps, Shelley, you can speak a little bit to the potential around piggybacking, and you've mentioned pushing people in on the payment model.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe why we didn't do the economist model of cost-benefit, because that is hard. I would say we want kind of the trust attributes of trusted products with customer response and things like that do require resources. And so if we push to a lower cost model, what does that mean? So I'm a little worried about going to free-based, and I saw this morning on just the mobile money articles that were coming out, somebody was taking away their free P2P transfer. So I think it's a great way to get people on. I worry about sustainability, but I know price can be a barrier, but we want to think about it in a way that it doesn't become something that undercuts the other investments. So I think I don't have a strong answer for that, but it's hard. I know we would like it to be affordable, and I think the question is, what does that mean? In the agriculture space, there's a lot of great work being done on the finance gap in ag for smallholder farmers, and part of the conclusions I think being reached is you got to have a subsidy. So we've seen that in telecom and technology for other things. Do we need a subsidy to make those prices lower? But we need to pay the providers for the products to be of the quality that we can trust. So
affordable doesn't necessarily mean sustainable.
Yeah.
So a question here from Neve. Can we use this model to test how trust intersects with gender and literacy and other such variables? And I'm not sure, Neve, maybe you can just point out if you mean traditional literacy or digital literacy or financial literacy, but just thinking about other, trust in other areas.
Well, this is a technology adoption model, so I think it starts with that. While it has behavior change, it was really developed to kind of test technology. So I would think on that point you'd need to, for this model to be relevant, you'd need to start with, is there a technology application I want to look at analytically through the model? So I'm not sure those literacy issues, there might be better models for that than this one.
I think literacy would also certainly inform, every aspect of how the respondent feels about perceived usefulness and ease of use. So that's kind of how it comes in there.
For sure. Another question here. How do you diagnose or identify which are the relevant trust drivers in a given market? Knowing how context-specific different markets are.
Well, I think that's why it needs to be locally based work. So I think this is the launch pad for people to think about that, but I think it's something we did hear from our peer reviewers that, it's don't cite one study or a couple studies and say that's it, that's the solution. So I think that was very wise advice. And I think even regionally it will vary. So within a country that Fernando mentioned in Nigeria, the north may be very different than the south and might be true in Ghana as well. So I think that's where we have to be super intentional. So we have to figure that out, and so there needs to be some diagnostic. And maybe of the 5 attributes we identified, there's different role for different organizations as well. Maybe researchers really would probe one issue versus regulators would take on the product recourse. So I think that baseline data, we're starting to have more data sets and they're gender disaggregated. So I would say first try to do the diagnostic and look at these 5 as a menu, and then maybe that's a step before you look at the 5 attributes. Know your population, right?
I think we always sort of want to copy and paste one approach into another market.
Yeah.
Just because there are similarities, that doesn't mean it's the same market.
Yeah.
So, I think really just gathering an evidence base around this, and, Shelley's really put a call out there for who's been working in this space. We know that plenty of the people on the call on this webinar will be familiar or know people who are familiar. So please drag them kicking and screaming into this conversation. Got a question here from Jennifer. Are there concerns that INGOs will lose trust of women if we promote usage of products where DSS providers are not adequately addressing trust and making product recourse easier? Does the paper look at this? Just passing, it's a long question.
Yeah. So, it was interesting. Good question, Jennifer, and we were having this conversation this morning. We're not advocating blind trust. And so we're not saying that if the product that isn't there in a way that works, let's not go tell women or anyone, trust it. So I think that is very important. that the diligence be there and the support mechanisms be there, either to bring the provider along, maybe like we've seen with the digitization of the savings group where CARE, Oxfam, Mercy Corps, Grameen, others have had a very primary role in making sure that worked. But you're right, one failed transaction will undo everything. So I do not think INGOs should be put in that position, and they should fully vet and get commitments and maybe, you know, start, if you're unsure, don't do it, or look at a menu of things, or do a slow rollout to make sure it's there. But you're right, absolutely right. We don't want to instill blind trust that could reverse any hope that this would be a mechanism for financial inclusion. So how you figure that out, I think, again, is market by market. We have some more mature markets. We have some less mature markets.
Yeah, the one thing I would double down on is this whole point of the NGO being the conduit to the service provider. I see it as a tremendous opportunity, and we've actually seen it back in the days of MFIs, right, where NGOs were actually playing that role where they're facilitating relationships to microfinancial institutions, and there's always a level of risk there and over-indebtedness and whatnot, and the product's just not being the right fit for the women's groups, and so I don't see much difference. Right. Obviously, there's some nuances now with the way technology works and whether it's even out there. But I would see it as doing sort of the due diligence and really sort of vetting as opposed to sort of promoting for something blindly.
Great. And one final question from Josephine. Is there data on financial inclusion of female youth? Can you give any examples of products that are developed for this segment and how they tackle trust? Anyone around the table?
Well, I know
Female youth, yes.
Oh, okay.
I know Findex, the recent Findex, does do a lot of division of data by youth. I would assume that's gender disaggregated as well, but you might have to go into the metadata to find that. But I know that was a call-out that seemed to be a new call-out in the Findex of this year. So I think that's a great place. Also, I know MasterCard Foundation now has a strategy focused on youth. So I have not seen a lot of it, but I think it's a growing field of interest. And there's certainly been a lot of campaigns around youth financial literacy before. I haven't seen anything on DFS per se.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything specific. I mean, I know that in a lot of places, at least where the DFS practice has engaged, like Uganda, you know, most of the, I think it's about 80% of the population is under 15, so you're sort of dealing with youth regardless. But yeah, I haven't seen anything specific in youth. I would say that in many markets that we work in, what's very interesting and what we are sort of have our eyes on is seeing the youth market segment as sort of the early adopter of a lot of these technologies. But in terms of actual resources, nothing comes to mind, but we'll certainly scratch our heads and see if we can find something.
Please sing out. You know, if anyone on the line is aware of any resources, we'd be very interested to see them. And I think, you know, that really speaks to this constant thing that people in this space bang on about, which is that women are not a segment, and the difference in use cases between, you know, youth and the elderly, women who are, you know, in relationships, not in relationships. There are thousands, millions of different, you know, subgroups. So we're actually at time here, but before we bow out, I'd like to remind everyone that there is a survey, and you could win a free car. all of that work down the drain. Yeah, there's no free car, but there's an amazing survey. So it's the link is in the chat. Please join the community of practice. Please send us your stories or your experiences with trust. We really would like to take this further and not just let it end with a webinar, but start to move in the direction of action. So thanks to all of the panelists, Mandana, Shelley, and Fernando. And thank you to everyone who joined in. We really appreciate it. I'm sorry we didn't get through all the questions, but thanks for being such an engaged audience. It's great.